in this 2D20 rules breakdown, we're going to talk about metacurrencies. There are 3 metacurrencies in 2D20 games. Sometimes the names are a little bit different for them, but we're going to use 3. And then depending on what property you're looking at, you can translate. There's momentum, there is threat, and there is
probably threat.
Usually threat. And then there is determination or fortune. I'm going to call it fortune because that's more common than determination.
I'm going to call it infinity points.
Oh, okay. Okay, you're going to call it infinity points for infinity.
It's the super currency, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So in the core mechanic episode, really quickly, hopefully if you've watched that or listened to it, you remember that it is possible to roll more successes than necessary. So for example, if you're rolling against a difficulty 1 test and you roll 3 successes, we're not going to go over the core mechanic again, so we won't tell you how you're going to roll those 3 successes. You have to go back and watch that episode. If it was a difficulty 1 and you roll 3 successes, you have 2 extra successes. As a player, those surplus successes become points of momentum. They become points of momentum. And momentum is the primary player used metacurrency. And I think the easiest way the way I've described this to people, and add as you wish, obviously, the way I describe this to people is that all the games provide you with a menu of costs. This costs 1 momentum. That costs 2 momentum. 1 extra point of damage costs 1 momentum. Adding the knockdown effect costs 2. I know in Conan, to disarm an opponent with a 1-handed weapon costs 2. For a 2-handed weapon costs 3. So there are in each of the games tables with various point-based spends. It's like a menu. And after the roll, you have this momentum. You can buy additional damage effects, things like that, based on how much momentum you have and what options you have available to you.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the advantages, unlike other systems where, I want to do a disarm, I want to do a knockdown, I want to do a called shot, and it always bumps up the difficulty, it makes it harder, and then you fluff it and you achieved nothing.
Right.
2D20 is the other way. You roll, you probably hit the person you wanted to because you put some stuff in to get a better roll. And then, right, you got all this extra momentum. Right, now you can do something cool because you got a good roll. Okay, and if you want to disarm, you go, I'm going to try and disarm. You make the roll. If you get enough, you can disarm it. Now, one of the other really important things we can do with these is momentum is buy extra dice. We mentioned this in the previous episode. One of the most important things to do with momentum is just get an extra dice, which actually means if you don't want to mess around with this big table of stuff, you can just use your momentum. Right, I've got some momentum. I'm going to spend my momentum on improving my next roll.
Right.
So
I'm going to improve the likelihood of me succeeding.
Yeah. And then you succeed, you get more momentum. I'm going to keep that momentum and use the next roll. Or most people, you say, just use it on damage.
Yep.
So if you're like, there's all these different things you can use momentum for, but you could literally break it down to 2 things, getting more dice on your rolls and doing extra damage in combat, and just leave it at that. Yep. You don't have to do any of the other stuff. Nope. There's other stuff you can do. And if you want to get into it, you can just do that.
Very simple. So you can spend momentum before you roll to buy extra dice, or you can spend it after the roll to shape the success that you just experienced. Because obviously you can't spend momentum after the roll, because if you haven't generated momentum, you couldn't have been successful.
Yes.
It's possible to roll 2 successes on a difficulty 2 test and generate no momentum, but it's impossible to generate momentum if you failed in the first place. So you spend before or you spend after. And if you don't spend all of your points, you bank them in a party pool, which in all the games maxes out at 6. So if you have success that you don't know what to do with, surplus success, you leave it for the next player in the group. Or you have some nice cross-table talk and decide, oh, hey, you need 2 momentum to trigger that cool special ability of yours, character, unique to a character. So I'm only going to spend 1 of the momentum I generated. I'm going to leave those 2 for you so you can do cool things. That I've seen generate a lot of good, like game-focused meta table conversation, not, talking about Monty Python and crap like that.
It gives you really cool things. Like if you've got a character, maybe they're not very good in combat, you can, right, I'm going to do a thing that I know I'm good at. Like I'm going to shout abuse at a bad guy and distract them to generate a load of momentum. I'm not doing any damage, but then I'm going to put that momentum in a pool for the next guy who's really good at fighting is then going to use that to go for some like massively killer roll. You can genuinely you pay it forward to your team. So again, if you've got someone's like, I don't know what to do with this momentum, just bank it for your teammates. Let your teammates have it and they can use it.
There is no such thing as a personal momentum pool outside of John Carter of Mars. John Carter of Mars is the only 2D20 property where each player has their own momentum pool. The rest, it's all you either use it, bank it, or lose it. And the party pool maxes out at 6. Something that I just said that made me think is that cross talk, that table talk. There's always table talk. What you want as a GM or a player who wants to play a good session is you want players and the GM to have game focused and story focused crosstalk at the table, not BSing about a movie they saw last week and then the session kind of falls off the rails. This and the banking and trading and future use of momentum really encourages that. So I'll just throw that out there.
So that's momentum.
Yep.
But obviously, one of the things we just point out is it might be that actually you do a really good roll and you generate a load of momentum, but you spend all that momentum and all the cool stuff you can do. And then it's the next player's go and you left him with no momentum.
Right.
Because you're one of my players.
Or maybe you just were unsuccessful. How's that? There was no momentum anyway.
If you've got no momentum, how do you get extra dice then? Well, there is another way. We've mentioned this already. It's threat. Now, again, this might be called something different in different things like Doom, which is my favorite.
Or Heat.
But mostly it's called threat. Threat is like the game master currency. Okay. Game master can do everything that the players can, but instead of using momentum, they use threat. So they can spend threat to make the bad guys get better rolls. They can spend threat to do extra damage, all the same stuff. The one extra thing you can do, well, the GM gets a couple of extra things they can do threat with, but really that would be a whole nother episode. So don't worry about that. But what you can do is if you have no momentum in the pool, okay, you can buy yourself extra dice by giving the GM extra threat. Now, essentially what you are doing then is improving your odds right now of you succeeding for in the future, the GM is going to be able to throw that back at you. Which actually is a cool thing. What you might have is during this, during the whole of a big game session, you're generating lots and lots of successes because you're doing loads of cool stuff and you're having to give loads of threat to the GM to make sure you can do all this amazing cool things. But then at the end of it, the GM's going to have a big stack of their threat, which is going to come back and bite you. So, it's a risk reward kind of thing there.
Now, I've heard people say that 2D20 creates an adversarial arrangement between GM and players, and I disagree with that completely. I mean, the metacurrency of threat actually, in a way, limits the GM from being a jackass and being like, the boulder falls on you because you pissed me off or something like that, because it puts a number to it. It gives structure to it. And actually, I think from a GM perspective, I find that threat guides me to think more creatively in the moment because I have these menus. They're the same as the momentum menus. And I have this threat piling up in front of me. And it reminds me to think about when to put my foot down on the gas of the plot and when to lighten up. It's something concrete that serves as a reminder. And so the whole idea of adversarial, you know what? I don't care what the system is. If your GM is a jerk, you will have an adversarial GM. It doesn't matter what the mechanic sitting in front of them is. This system does not do that. It doesn't create that arrangement.
So we did mention there was a third kind of
metacurrency,
which is not a word I like, but it is. And the third one, I would say, it's called determination in some games, fortune in others, but it's also been called like infinity points and
it's super momentum, basically.
It's super momentum.
Yeah.
And essentially you get a handful, you get one or two of these points. These are the kind of things you see in other games. In lots of other games, you might have one or two things like story points, and you get them for the whole episode. And you hold on to them because you don't know whether to use them. This is very similar. There are ways to gain them, usually by good role playing or doing something super heroic the GM could throw you. But essentially, it's like super momentum. So one of the main things is you spend one of these points and it gives you a dice automatically turned to a 1, which is, you've seen our previous episode, is usually a critical success, which gives you 2. So you spend one of these super points and you essentially get 2 successes right off the bat. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed if the difficulty is really high, but it's going to help.
But it helps. Yeah. So I think that I'll just call it fortune. You have a fixed number, you can gain it through role playing, and it's owned by the player. It's not a communal resource. And each of the spends, there's a short list. Each of the spends is higher powered than any individual momentum spend. So I like the fact that, like you just said, actually backing up, most systems have a metacurrency. It's more like fortune. It does something big and splashy, but they're in such short supply that players hoard them. And then the idea of having this mechanic by which players can more gracefully and actively shape the narrative in the story, they end up not using it. And so then the players aren't shaping their narrative in the story like we would want them to. The nice thing about 2D20 is it offers both. It offers a currency that's high value and in short supply, that's totally controlled by the individual player. And then it provides the more fluid resource, which is momentum. So the biggest thing, GM and player, if you're coming to this system new, spend momentum. Use it. Yeah. Don't hoard it. Use it, use it, use it. Buy more dice so that you can generate more successes and generate more momentum. If you feel like you need to hoard, save your fortune. Use that in the clutch moments, but momentum is meant to be spent and used. It's meant to be. It's not meant to be something that's held on to.
And if it sounds like a lot of different these things, you're going to actually, as the GM, you only worry about threat. As the GM, you have threat. The players can give you more threat to play with, and you only spend threat. You only have one currency to deal with. The GM just deals with threat.
There are a handful of NPCs. Depending on the game, there are some high-level, high-power NPCs that will have fortune of their own, but not many. That's like your nemesis. That's like, Blofeld or Cobra Commander or whatever. You're not going to have that many. In most cases, GMs just deal with threat.
And then as a player, you've got your momentum that you generate, but then either you spend it immediately. So you don't have, you literally, you generate it. It's a number in your head. You spend it, or it goes into a group pool. And then you have these other counters. I mean, I deal with these by having different colored poker chips. I will usually use red poker chips for my threat, and I will have green because green is lucky as my determination or fortune, whatever it's called. And then I will have whatever poker chip color I happen to have a load of sitting around as my momentum. And that's what I have.
Yeah, I use red for threat, and I pile those up. I know some GMs like to hide the threat pool.
Pile
I put it right out there. I put it right out there because it adds dramatic tension. Yeah. I use blue poker chips for fortune, and I have a big, like 3 inches, 4 inches on a side foam die 6 that sits in front of me, and that's where I track the momentum for the party, because either whatever you generate in the moment, you either use it, bank it, or lose it. So there's no need to have a pile.
No,
I use the big foam die. So there you go. One bit of advice with momentum, whether you're a new player or a new GM, I would go ahead and look at one of these menus, these tables, and I would look, how much does it cost to buy extra D20s? How much does it cost to buy extra damage? And maybe pick one other thing. The first time or two you play the game, I would write those on a Post-it note and just limit yourself to that. And once you get comfortable with that, then start turning to the table, and then you'll start memorizing the stuff. It's not complicated. It's just you don't want to bury yourself in analysis paralysis at the table, especially with a system that can move so quickly and keep the action up.
And there you go. That's how to use these different 3 kinds of currencies in 2D20.
Here we are. All right. So thanks as always for listening to this episode. Make sure to like
and subscribe.
Both those things. And we would love for you to leave some comments, start a conversation with us and with others.
Or come and join us on our Discord.
Both. The links to those are, where are you supposed to point?
I know, down here somewhere.
That's right. The links are below. That's what you're supposed to do on YouTube. So we just did that. All right, groovy.